Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please just give us a few moments while we wait for others to join in. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning, and a few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation, and if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question. We'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well, and you can ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels. Once the tour is over, if you would like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Karen, who will be presenting on 19th century British painting. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Ilse. As I mentioned last time, Ilse is our new intern for the Timken Educational Department, and she is a prestigious award-winning USD student. I just want to make a comment. There's a gentleman, I believe his name is Frank, he's at the beach listening to this lecture, and I just think what a great idea. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about British painting. I do want to, and we're looking at a wonderful J.M.W. Turner, who I will be discussing, because Turner, probably along with John Constable, are the most important landscape painters in England in the 19th century, in the earlier part of the 19th century. But before we really talk about individual artists, I want to kind of tell you that I'm going to be speaking about the Romantic movement, and not only art, but a little bit in literature, because they're very inextricably united. This is an era in England where literature, the sonnets, writing, poetry, the great poets are linked with these painters. Some of them, like William Blake, not only does artwork, but writes his own poetry. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood that begins about 1838. And that is an organization of 7 artists who harken back to earlier times. And as we get to the Pre-Raphaelites, I will indicate some of their various unique characteristics, let's put it that way. Just quickly, historically, England is a very interesting place. England has witnessed or participated in multiple wars in the 18th century. We had the American Revolution, which the British lost. They they win over France in the Napoleonic Wars, but it does affect them, as does the French Revolution. So it is a time of a lot of wars at the end of the 18th century. And another thing that's happening in England is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution begins in England a little earlier than it does in France, for example, around 1760, and it goes into about 1840. That is sort of the height of the Industrial Revolution. Well, it changes England in many ways. It changes it in terms of technology, mass production, a movement of individuals from the countryside and an agrarian way of life to an industrial, mass-produced way of life. There's developments in bridge building, communications, transportation, gas, electric, lots of interesting and important things are going on in England. However, it also changes the dynamic of London. We see the doubling of the population. We see poverty. We see smoke billowing from the factories that pollutes the air. We have very stratified societal groups, such as, the higher ups, but we also have workers who are struggling in these impoverished situations. We have a lot of illness. We have a lot of children who are in subpar housing situations, working in factories, developing diseases like rickets and malnutrition. And you can really get the point of all this if you read the work of Charles Dickens. Read Oliver Twist, Christmas Carol, and you'll see how he was horrified by some of the changes in England. Now, two more things, and then we'll start looking at the art. We do have two periods going on at this time. The Georgian period with the kings, three Georgian Hanover kings, and that ends about 1837 with Queen Victoria. And so we have two eras really happening. And we'll begin by looking at work from the more Georgian era. If we could advance this first slide. And here we have William Blake, the Ancient of Days. Now you can see this is at the very latter part of the 18th century. Let's talk about what's happening in England and France a little bit artistically. This is the end of the sort of the beginning, of the neoclassical period, but Blake moves away from that interest. He is interested in his own unique perspective on the world, on art, and he looks to biblical references. Now, these artists were not necessarily religious, like caught up in the Anglican Church, but they do use religious references in many of their artworks and poetry. Now, this is The Ancient of Days. This was actually a book written by Blake, and this is the cover of one of the books, and only 9 of these are extant in the world today, so it's very valuable. And this is Urizen, and it comes from the book of Daniel, and so he's going through these sort of proverbs and biblical references, and it creates this character. And they are moving away from rational thought and going into more mystical, romantic imagery. And you can see that. If you were to compare this painting, let's say, with a neoclassical image, like from Jacques-Louis David, you would see that this is much more colorful, gestural, light infused, very different. So these artists like Blake are moving away from rational thought, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason from the 18th century, and going into their own mystical, spiritual quests. And things are very romanticized. That's why we call these artists romantic artists. And Urizen holds a caliper. This is an architectural tool, and he is helping to kind of create the world. And he is a man pictured as a very older man, a man full of wisdom. And so that is part of the imagery here. And thank you, Ilse, for swirling around that. That's very important. Let's go on to his next work. And this is a really captivating piece. The great dragon here hovering with horns and wings, and he's hovering over this woman clothed. And this woman clothed in Blake's reference is suggesting the Virgin Mary, suggests Christianity as a whole. And she stands on the moon, and swirling figures at the bottom are in rapture looking at her. And then we have this red dragon, the great red dragon, and he represents Satan. So what we look at is an image really from the book of Revelations, but it is Blake's take on this. And he wants to discuss the tumultuous situation in England after, as the Industrial Revolution is going on, but also what has happened to England after all these wars, because this is the time when many wars have just been wrapping up, and it leaves England very vulnerable. One thing I do want to mention is that England really doesn't have a lot of allies. They've lost their allegiance with France. Remember, they're at war. American colonies have dissipated. So the Netherlands is no longer interested in working with them. So England feels a little bit adrift. So that is what's happening politically. But we have also this, again, this interest in poetry. Remember, this is the era of the Romantic poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, They're also hearkening to older poets like John Milton. So this is very much capturing what is happening in romantic poetry, individual interests, as of Blake and his writing in watercolors. And one other thing I do want to mention about Blake is not only was he an artist and a writer, but he created books. He was a bookmaker in his earlier times. So he was a very brilliant, artistic individual. We can go to the next piece, please. All right, Geoffrey Chaucer. So if you study Chaucer in college or English literature in college, you know that Geoffrey Chaucer was the first truly British writer of, great consideration. And he does write these tales. There are 24 tales about 29 pilgrims who leave a certain location outside of London, and they go to Canterbury Cathedral, and they want to honor Thomas Becket, who was martyred. And so what Blake creates is a beautiful representation of all these figures who are going to these 29 pilgrims, and they're all from different walks of life. Some of them are more aristocratic. Some of them are more of the lower realms of society. And he creates a very medieval-like line of figures. It's exquisitely done. And it's really nice to see that he did multiple images of this. So we have an engraving, because I told you he was a bookmaker. So he did a lot of engraving, printmaking, watercolors. And above we have, which is probably watercolor or gouache, a mixed media piece. And we see it's aligned like something you would see in a scroll. So again, these romantic artists, particularly when we look at the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, they look back on the Quattrocento, Raphael. They look at chivalry and medieval life and the focus on women. So you can see that he incorporates those elements. And we have a beautiful, if we could look at right here, this beautiful architectural element, this arched recessed architectural point. We have birds in the sky, sun, a light coming through, and Blake was very good at capturing light. So we will move on. And now we're going to talk about J.M.W. Turner. Turner was, along with John Constable, the most important landscape artists of Britain of the 19th century. So instrumental in developing art in that time and place. Now, Turner was very interested in new things that were being created technologically in England. He was interested in bridges and buildings, but he was really captivated by the sea. And so he looks to the sea for inspiration. What is also so important about Turner, and if you go to the Tate Modern, the Tate Gallery in England today in London, you will see rooms full of Turners. Now, Turner, unlike Constable, believed in the power of nature. Man does not coexist peacefully with nature. He is often overcome by nature. And you can see in this very vivid, churning sea that the boat is about to capsize, and people are desperately trying to leave the scene of this catastrophic situation. We have the white caps of the waves that indicate they're very powerful. We have a storm in the background. And what is particularly interesting about this is we don't know. For example, Géricault, the great French romantic painter, who did a painting a little bit late, about 8 years after this, and the Raft of the Medusa, which I've shown a while back. Now that one, the reason why I bring that up, that also talks about a shipwreck, a terrible storm, things happening, but that was from a true journalistic story. we do not know if Turner read about a shipwreck or just imagined that this might have occurred. But we know that he was very taken up with this type of activity. His brushstrokes are more gestural, more painterly, not in any way neoclassical, very romantic. If we could go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, Turner and the Pre-Raphaelites, they were very interested in history. So Dido, who was a Phoenician queen, which would be today Tunisia, was written about in Virgil's The Aeneid. And we'll just go back for right there, that's perfect. And it was from Roman times, Virgil, and this predates Roman civilization, this story. And Dido was the queen of Carthage, and she was trying to rebuild her city. And if you can see on the left-hand bank, the woman in the blue and white to the left there, she is Dido, the queen. And her husband has been dead, and I believe he was murdered, and he is buried in the building on the right that looks like a Corinthian engaged column, so it looks like a later Greek architecture. And we see a figure on the parallel to her, and that would be the love of her life, the king, the prince, sorry. And what is happening is it's really showing how Carthage is in a very vulnerable spot, because at the bottom of the left-hand side, we see children playing with little boats, and they're very fragile. And it indicates that her civilization is also very fragile. And again, it's commenting on what Turner thinks about what is really happening to England, its fragility, it's going through all these wars. And not to say that the Georgian period did not have some wealth and economic growth in England, but there was also a lot of economic downturn as well. Look at the beautiful light infused sky. That actually indicates a more positive outlook, because he's also commenting not only that England has kind of escaped a lot of these wars or had to participate and suffer, but he wants to represent England as the dawning of a new empire. So that is a more positive take on this pre-Roman topic. All right, we will move on. Now, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. This comes from Milton's work, and it's a narrative poem, pardon me, not John Milton, Lord Byron, I beg your pardon. And it was in 5 parts. So Byron wrote about this pilgrimage of Childe Harold, and Childe Harold refers to, it's Old English, and it means someone who is studying for the knighthood. And so Childe Harold is discovering his way in the world. He's world weary. He's been traveling, seeking enlightened thought. And it's a very, although we're moving away a bit from the Enlightenment, it is a very romantic subject, how one finds their place in the world, place in the cosmos. This is an oil on canvas. One thing that Turner does, even though he creates very tumultuous, somewhat real incidents that happen, and we're going to see that in just a second, he also uses a very poetic, ethereal, visionary way of capturing scenes. And this natural beauty is very reminiscent of the 17th century artists. If you look at Claude Lorrain in France, if you look at some of the 17th century Dutch painters, you see that there's a lot of inspiration, particularly Claude Lorrain. And you also have this idea of, I don't know if you can see this, but you can see the figures resting. You can see some of the ruins here. And you get a sense of almost an Arcadian landscape. What do I mean by this? This is not a realistic landscape. It's very poetic, romanticized, and exquisite. But we get a sense of almost like a dreamscape, and that is what Turner is looking toward. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. Now, the burning of the Houses of Parliament. Wow, what a story. This actually did take place in 1834. What had happened is, in the Houses of Parliament, there is a basement, and one of the workers there, he was the clerk, one of the clerks, he decided that because they were often voting in the Houses of Parliament, they would utilize wooden sticks, almost like a popsicle stick. And they just built up a supply of these. And this clerk decided, we really don't need all these sticks. I think I'll burn them. So what does he do? In not a very intelligent manner, he sets the sticks afire. Well, he burns the Houses of Parliament. And a very tragic situation. To the left of the Houses of Parliament, which is in the middle of the painting, the middle of the watercolor, we will have Westminster Abbey, the great cathedral. And then we have all these figures in the foreground would be people watching as the water cascades over the burning building. It almost looks like we have a waterfall. And this is just the water streaming. And in between here, we actually have the River Thames, because this is near the River Thames. So this is a real occurrence. He did read about it. He actually did a different version. He was standing in this group of people and doing a plein air documentation of what had happened. But he also later went into a boat on the Thames to try to capture another perspective. So quite an extraordinary feat for him. But look at how romanticized this is. This isn't hyper real. It's diffuse. It's abstract. And that's why many artists in subsequent decades really looked at Turner in the evolution of abstraction, because he captures this very monumentous situation in a very abstracted manner of painting. All right, we will just move on. And we're going to go to a colleague, another great of the 19th century. And as I mentioned earlier, John Constable, like Turner, was the most important. They were the two most important landscape painters of the 19th century, particularly in England, but maybe for other countries as well. Now, Constable was quite different than Turner. Constable's work is much more representational. He is interested in a completely different concept than Turner, where Turner sees man being overcome by nature. John Constable sees man in an idyllic setting. He harkens back to his childhood in Suffolk area, and he loved his childhood. His father had a water mill that would grind the corn. Now, remember, this is during the time of the Industrial Revolution. He is looking at the time that which is more idyllic and not so industrialized, and when people lived in the countryside and worked in the countryside. He also shows a barge and some young people on the left-hand side in the middle ground to the foreground moving on a barge, because his father also was involved with barge building. And you see a young man pulling the horse. You see the empty lines here, and it's just exquisite. It reminds us very much of the 17th century Dutch painters who inspired Constable. So Flatford Mill was where his father worked. And I apologize, I think there's a little bit of a mistype on the title, because it wasn't burning. I think that was just carried over inadvertently from the burning of the Houses of Parliament. But you see, he captures in a very realistic manner the trees, the nature, the houses. This is a very 17th century Dutch sky. The lower horizon line, these very detailed trees, the young boy as he pulls the wagon, and you will actually see that when we look at the hay wain, his most important painting. So we'll go on to the next image. And probably the most important painting done by Constable is the hay wain. And a hay wain is a hay wagon. And he painted this as part of what we call a group of six. The group of six was large scale paintings that he wanted to create a body of work. Some of them were commissioned. And this one was considered probably the #2 most important painting in all of 19th century English history. Why? It was so greatly received. Everybody could relate to this. Now you have to remember, even though Turner was a very important painter, it's not as esoteric of a style. This is real. You can see what is happening here. You can see the light-filled sky. You can see the little cottage. Now, the little cottage to the left was where was the subject of some of his other paintings, but it was a cottage of a man who lived in this region, Suffolk County, who helped his father and never left the county. He was a hermit, and he maybe 4 days in this man's entire life was outside of this region, and he stayed in this cottage. And I think that Constable found that to be a very romantic idea. He, again, he harkens back to his idyllic childhood. And you see a dog, a little white and black dog in the foreground, and he's directing our eye to the hay wain. And what the young man is doing is attempting to cool the horses. I believe there's 3 horses. It's kind of hard to see. He's attempting to cool the horses' legs. And he wants to try to expand the wheels of this hay wagon, because if he doesn't, it will be a difficult procedure to get it out of the water. So he's trying to kind of expand it, give the horses a rest, and then he can continue to pull it. But it is light filled. We have a little bit of clouding in the sky, but the light is magnificent. The details on the foliage, remarkable. He carefully crafts foreground, middle ground, and background, again, using that low horizon line inspired by the Dutch. And as I mentioned earlier, probably his most important painting. So we'll move on. And also another beloved painting, done a little bit later, is Salisbury Cathedral. Now, it's important to sort of think about what religion is like in England, because we have the Anglican Church. And Salisbury Cathedral was a Gothic cathedral, and it was originally a Catholic cathedral, and then it became Anglican, the Church of England. Many of these artists, when I showed you, let's say, the work of Blake, and they looked at some of the Book of Revelations, Book of Daniel, Book of Solomon, they weren't necessarily religious. They were not necessarily religious men. However, that is not true for Constable. Constable was a very religious man. He always had been a very pious man, and he had a very strong relationship with the 2 bishops, Bishop Fisher and his nephew by the same name, who were bishops of the cathedral. And he often visited them and talked about scripture. And I believe that they commissioned this painting. So what do we have here? Again, he uses this technique of a dog in the foreground. We have a dog here, and we have 3 horses pulling the cart across the meadow. And the focus is on the weather. Remember, science is developing too in the 19th century, as it began even in the 17th century. And people are looking to understanding weather. We need it for everything from transportation to farming. And they are very interested in weather, the effects of weather. And we see a beautiful rainbow after a storm, but the storm has not been finished. There's still remnants of it. And actually, if you look very closely around the spire of the cathedral, you even see lightning. There's an element of lightning striking. Also, the palette is much darker, much more ominous. So there's a sense of a little bit of foreboding, as you often would see in the Dutch landscape painters, because what they would indicate, and there's some suggestion of that in this Salisbury Cathedral, that things can change at any time. Weather changes, life changes, and things can have a rapid turnaround. So there's a bit of a hint of that. But it's also that sort of reference, a spiritual reference for the cathedral, for his Christian spirituality, and then this hope opening up, that we all look for hope and rebirth. And so here we have this magnificent darkened sky with the Gothic, exquisite Gothic cathedral. And then we have, of course, the wagon here being pulled across the water. And then again, some of the little architectural elements here. So again, one of his most magnificent and very large scale canvas. Now, we're going to move on, I believe, to Samuel Palmer. And yes, Entranced by Nature. Samuel Palmer was very influenced by William Blake, and he fits the pattern of these romantic writers and painters. This is actually a watercolor, which is kind of interesting because when I look back, obviously in the Timken, if you recall, our collection, and I hope you visit soon when we reopen, we don't really have on display watercolors or prints. So I am using some of these multiple images, not a watercolor, but for example, printmaking, engraving. Those are a way of creating multiple images because a lot of these artists were connected to bookmaking and writing. So they didn't always create large scale paintings as you would see with Turner and Constable. These are meant to be part of books oftentimes or to illustrate poetry. And here we have a very interesting, we have a tower, and in this tower, we see that it's very lonely, and it was inspired by a poem by John Milton from the 1600s. I think it's called Il Penseroso. And if I'm not mistaken, it is thinking, to be pensive, to be thinking. So these figures in the right-hand side are contemplating their place in the cosmos, and they're also contemplating divine intervention. Palmer was not religious as was Constable in the same sense of being kind of devoted to the Anglican Church, but he had this kind of spiritual interest, and he feels that there is enlightenment to be gained. And in this tower, it is said that enlightenment will kind of be revealed, and it's actually like a little lantern that lights up this single tower, and that's why it's called Lonely. And what he did is to capture the night sky in such a poetic manner. He would literally, and you'll see that, and we'll see it in a couple of the other images that he does, he kind of etches them out. He uses mixed media, and then he sees these young people contemplating this tower, enlightenment. And then we have a figure across a chasm, and we have an owl flying out of the chasm, and then we have the sheep, because like Constable, Palmer talked a lot about nature, farming, and you see a lot of times elements of farming would be incorporated into his painting. So this is based on John Milton from 1640. It is sort of this divine knowledge and spirituality that we hope to gain. Okay, I hope we can move on to The Harvest Moon, also by Samuel Palmer. And Palmer is a really interesting figure. He, as I said, he was a poet, a writer, an artist, very inspired by William Blake, looked a lot at Blake's work. He was kind of, for want of a better term, he was really interested in kind of not the occult exactly, but he was interested in really kind of spiritual and kind of metaphorical images and issues. And you can really see that in this. This is like something taken out of a dream. And it's very true with Blake and Palmer. Often their dreams would produce this wonderful imagery. And here we have these two lone figures watching the dance of the harvest in the moonlight, this exquisite light, that sort of chiaroscuro that falls on these figures. And of course, harvesting wheat, is a very typical endeavor for farmers in England at this time. But he creates a more mystical, spiritual dance. It's almost, these figures are wraith-like. They almost look like ghosts dancing in the field with this moon, low moon that hovers over them. And then we have these figures here that kind of wait and watch. So I see that I'm going a little too slowly. So we're going to move on because I do want to get to the Pre-Raphaelites, who we will be seeing momentarily. Again, this is another, just really quickly, another version of the harvest moon. And many times subject matter would be done multiple times. And again, we have these people looking over the chasm, and we see the city and behind them, and they're gathering these stalks of wheat. And it's a very autumnal image, I would think, because of the time that we are in. So because of the time, I think I'm going to move on, and we'll go to the Pre-Raphaelites. Okay, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, it was made up mostly of 7 artists: Dante Gabriele Rossetti, we have Holman Hunt, we have Millet. So we have 7 artists who knew each other at school, art school, I believe, and they've decided to create this brotherhood. And they hearken back to earlier times. They revered the Quattrocento. They loved earlier medieval literature and history and artwork. They liked the idea of knighthood and chivalry. They revered women. They looked at poetry and the Bible. And they had this brotherhood that lasted about 10 years. So this would be kind of on the edge of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It gets its name from the artist Raphael, because they felt that Raphael was a little too classical, as it were, and they wanted to go back to earlier times. Now, Dante Gabriele Rossetti's father was an academic, did a lot of translations. They spent a lot of time in Italy, and he was named after the writer Dante. He knew Italian, and that was kind of inspirational to him. And he looked at biblical stories. Now, this is very unusual in that we have such a realistic depiction of Mary being taught to embroider by her mother Anne. And many people really didn't take to this Pre-Raphaelite style until actually Charles Dickens starts to criticize them, and then began to get some notoriety, and subsequently became more popular. Now, we see Mary, as I mentioned, she's embroidering here with with her mother Anne, and we see a little angel that stares at these books of knowledge, and we have a white dove, the spirituality of Mary represented. We have a window that doesn't seem to really correspond what is happening in the interior space. It's almost like a loggia that she's sitting in. But for some reason, the Pre-Raphaelites often incorporated windows in their paintings. Now, at the base of Mary's feet is a 7-thorned briar, and then the 7 sheets of grass. And that talks about her suffering, particularly the thorns. And if you can see it in the foreground at the floor, these are very long thorns, very dangerous thorns. And again, as I mentioned, this is the book of knowledge, books of knowledge here. And we have a white lily for Mary's purity. This would be considered pre-Annunciation. I talked a lot about that in my last talk about the Virgin depicted in art. And we discussed some of the iconography. So they're mixing this iconography of past centuries of the Renaissance and incorporating a much more, let's say, 19th century approach. And again, the books of knowledge, this is also refers to Mary, this little lamp. And we have this open loggia, this woman who doesn't even seem to be, she's a woman just cultivating an arbor here. So there was a little bit of a critical element associated with some of these paintings because this sort of, as people would say, sort of mixing the metaphors. All right, so we'll go on to the next image, please. Thank you, Ilse. And now this is the Beloved. This is actually more of a marriage portrait. And if you look at this, you will see that the Beloved really looks so much like a painting by Titian. He was very much inspired by Titian, even though he was Venetian Renaissance, and that came earlier than the Quattrocento. Later than the Quattrocento. He still did harken back to some of these gifted Venetian painters. And this woman, this beautiful woman, she's wearing a Japanese gown. She has a Peruvian headdress. She's surrounded by her attendants. And she is really from the Book of Solomon. And if you know, the Book of Solomon in the Old Testament wasn't so much of prescribed doctrine. It was more about romantic relationships, a little more sensual. It talked about love and commitment. And so that's why, we have, of course, this title, The Beloved. The negative aspect of this would be to think about, well, one other person he was also influenced by Manet's Olympia, that was really popular and got some notoriety. But the thing I do want to mention is there's a negative quality to this painting that I do want to bring out, and many people might maybe bypass it, but we have a young, beautiful woman in the foreground, this young girl actually. And because the Beloved is so overblown in how she's placed in the painting, some people suggest that it's a little bit like, oh, white privilege, white beauty. And it did get a lot of negative comments about it because it seems to sort of personify beauty as being this white woman as opposed to this beautiful young girl. So that did bring some controversy into the painting, and it carries over today. And then, of course, we have these beautiful lilies, these faces that peek out her attendants. So the Beloved is a marriage portrait. It comes from the Book of Solomon. And we're going to also go to one that goes back to another Rossetti, and that is our next image. And this is a beautiful, I'm going to use the Greek term, I'm more comfortable with this, Persephone. Proserpine was the Latin version or the Roman version, but we'll tell the story. What was happening in Rossetti's life is he was actually having an affair with Jane Morris. And William Morris was another Pre-Raphaelite and very important to the movement. And Rossetti, Jane Morris was married to William Morris, and she had 2 children with him who she loved dearly. But she was carrying on this affair, so she was considered this forbidden fruit, just as Persephone holds the forbidden fruit of the pomegranate. So the story is Ceres, the god of grain, was her mother. And Pluto saw her on Earth, frolicking on Earth, and he fell in love with her, even though she had a boyfriend. And he captures her and drags her down to the underworld, to Hades, the underworld. And her mother, Ceres, begs Jupiter, please or Zeus, please allow my daughter to come back to Earth. I can't be without her. She's done nothing wrong. And Pluto says to the mother, I'm sorry, but your daughter ate 6 seeds from the pomegranate. And for that reason, she will remain in the underworld for 6 months out of the year. And that's how the Greeks talked about fall and winter, that fall and winter was when Persephone was in the underworld. And that when she's able to go back after 6 months, she will be in light of spring and summer. She's a beautiful woman. He did use some, of course, the faces of his beloved, but she holds a pomegranate. And then we have memory here. The ivy captures this idea of memory and the light as it shows that she would be looking up to the earth. And here she is in sadness with a lighted lamp to guide her. And of course, this exquisite depiction of a beautiful woman. So this is from Greek mythology and the story of Persephone. I'm going to go on because, again, I want to be able to give our viewers some time. Now, Jean Everett Millet came from a wealthy family. He was part of the Brotherhood of Seven. The Brotherhood actually kind of harkened back to the Nazarene movement. And again, they were interested in religious subject matter, but not necessarily deeply religious. Christ in the house of his parents. This took a lot of heat when it was first revealed. A lot of heat. Charles Dickens, who was alive at this time, did not like it. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in England, and they made comments as, I don't even want to say it, it's just so awful, but making comments at how Jesus could be this little red-haired child with some anti-Semitic comments attached to it. They said he looked like he had rickets, which was a disease prevalent during Industrial Revolution, and that Mary looks like a drunken has-been, which is so awful. I mean, these comments were just catastrophically bad. But let's talk a little bit about the story here. So Joseph is making a door, and we have Jacob's ladder here. We have Anne trying to pull out with pliers a nail that is embedded in our little Jesus here. And we have an attendant here represents the disciples. We have John the Baptist carrying water to bring over to clean Jesus's nail, which was the stigmata, of course. And we have the sheep as brethren here, the Christian brethren. So stylistically, it does seem very antiquated. When you think about the Pre-Raphaelites, it is a very sort of retro style. Stylistically, it is a little bit retro, and it did have its share of critics. It also had its share of enthusiasts, but you can see that if you think about what's happening in the 19th century, it does seem a little bit old-fashioned stylistically. But you can see, of course, all the wood carving. She kneels, this thin woman. But again, it does relate to some Christian imagery. So we're going to go to one more Pre-Raphaelite painting. And probably the most important Pre-Raphaelite painting was this one, Ophelia. It was considered probably the most beautiful. And it is the most, I would say, exquisite. And I will tell you a little bit about the story. Who was Ophelia? Well, she was in the story of Hamlet, the king of Denmark. And Hamlet, if you might recall, this was his love. He was to marry her, but he murdered her father in his insanity and began to denounce her. And she fled the palace, the Danish palace, and she goes into the countryside. Now, this is supposed to be Denmark, based on Shakespearean lore from Hamlet. But he, of course, isn't in Denmark. He's in England. So people kind of laugh like, oh, you have the English countryside and it's supposed to be in Denmark. But that's unimportant, really. And so what was the story that Ophelia too is driven mad by the loss of love of Hamlet. And she goes out she flees the castle and she goes out into the wilderness, into this garden, this beautiful garden with water lilies and roses and poppies. And she begins to sing, and she's swinging from a pine bower, and she falls into the water, and her body is uplifted by the clothing is, the water goes into the clothing, kind of buoys her up for a short time. But she doesn't make any effort to get out. She's kind of committing suicide, it is suggested. And she holds her hands in this prayer-like position, but it's almost, some people say almost sensual too. And she is floating, she may die. And you see the red poppy. And the poppy also was a flower like other flowers shown. And the Pre-Raphaelites attached a lot of meaning to flowers, as did the Dutch still life painters and the Flemish still life painters in the Baroque era. But so did the Pre-Raphaelites. So they attached a lot of meaning, like white and purity. But the rose poppy is poison. So she is floating. Now, the true nature of this is he had a young girlfriend who he used in this painting, and she almost died from, she wasn't in water like this. He did the water separately, plein air, and then he set up a hut with water like a bathtub and put her fully clothed. And he had these fans creating a kind of a wind tunnel, and she almost died from like bronchitis. Funny story, her father actually sued Millet because he said, listen, you almost caused my daughter's death. But anyway, in terms of beauty, this is probably one of the most beautiful Pre-Raphaelite paintings. We don't have a lot of time, so let's move on. And we're going to look at the word of Alfred Sisley. Now, you may say, why did you include Sisley? He spent a lot of time in France, but he was British, and he did paint a lot in England too. And I wanted to show you that there was an attachment by some of these English artists to the Impressionist movement, because this is done around the same time of Impressionist sunrise. And we have the his influence, he was influenced, by Renoir. He knew Monet. He came from a very wealthy family, and he had an allowance, so he had a lot of latitude in his paintings. He could go back and forth to England and France. However, his father, who had been a wealthy merchant, did lose his vast wealth when Sisley was in his early 30s. So Sisley did have to really kind of struggle and change the course of some of his artwork because of the fact that he no longer had an allowance. Now you can see a softer palette than if we were to compare it to, let's say, the work of Monet or Pissarro. There's a softer palette, and again, very much interested in some of the Dutch painters that he looked at. Also, what is really important in this painting is this bridge. And the bridge was interesting not only to Sisley, but Turner. Many of them were inspired by a lot of the use of iron and the bridges that were being built during the early part of the century because of the Industrial Revolution and the advancement of technology. We had, locomotives streaming through the countryside, bridges being built. And so we have the encroachment of technology on this beautiful French countryside. And then we have boaters on the water, this dappled sunlight. You can see this very impressionistic study right here of the light filled, and just a gorgeous depiction of nature on a sunny day. Again, for time, we will move on. And this is a beautiful allée of chestnut trees. So it's a little road that is mirroring the path of the trees, much more diffuse light, much more abstracted. We're well in the confines of the Impressionist movement. I believe this one might have been done also in France. And so I apologize, I was unable to get some images from the English countryside, but I do want to show you that there was a cross-pollination of Impressionist artists from England, and particularly Sisley, into the French, kind of a melding of French Impressionism. So look at the dappled sunlight. It's more abstracted, very painterly. One thing I do want to mention about Sisley, he was almost 100% a plein air artist. He did not, as some of them did, go back into the studio and complete these works. He preferred to stay outside, even in inclement weather, and capture the beauty of the landscape. We just have one or two more, and I just want to move on because we do want to see if you have any questions. Okay, El Halejo. John Singer Sargent was actually born in Italy and spent a lot of time. He was an American born in Italy, but he spent most of his time in England. And he was the great portrait painter of England. He was considered, let's say, like Van Dyck, a Flemish painter during the Baroque era. We have this dancer. She's a flamenco dancer. Many of his works were inspired by the work of Velázquez, the great Spanish Baroque artist. You can see these musicians, they're performing, they're singing. And this word jalejo refers to when flamenco music and dancing occurs, we have clapping and singing. And so it's kind of a standard form. She is an exquisite woman. She seems to be captured in movement. You can definitely see the black and white influence, the chiaroscuro that is influenced by Velázquez. And we'll just go to really quickly, we have like maybe one more minute. I just want to show you, this is a portrait of a high-born French woman. Her husband is a banker. This painting was not commissioned. He just wanted to gain some notoriety. And this portrait of Madame X caused a lot of concern because they thought it was too sensual. And this actually, the strap here on the dress was originally painted down. And he got a lot of guff for it. But anyway, we'll end here because we don't have much time. And I do enjoy when we have opportunity to hear if the audience has any questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. We will start taking questions, and I believe we do have some in the chat. Okay, there is a question from Frank. He asked earlier, how does Blake's imagery relate to the Ossian imagery a bit later in France, Girodet?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Yes. How does Blake's imagery relate to the Ossian, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, imagery a bit later in France, Girodet in parentheses?
Oh, I think he was, are you speaking of, can you answer, Frank, can you state your question? I'm a little concerned that I either don't understand it or don't know the answer, but if you could.
Sure. Later on in the early 19th century in France, Girodet, among others, do a series of paintings on the Ossian myths, which were portrayed as pre-Homeric, and I think were originally passed off as authentic pre-Homeric myths. But the reality was that they were done by, if I remember correctly, an Irish monk who put them forward, and then various painters, especially Girodet, did this fantastical imagery, which to me seems similar to that of Blake.
Of the ancient days, right?
Yeah, where you've clearly gone beyond, as you were discussing with Blake, neoclassic imagery, which more clearly defined lines, to imagery which is less defined and mystical kind of thing. So
right, exactly.
I was just wondering what the interplay may have been between Blake and that school of art.
Okay, I do think there was a cross-pollination, and you have to remember that Blake, because of his bookmaking, his writing, he could disseminate some of that information a lot more easily, as opposed to, let's say you have one painting, you see it, maybe you see copies, but because this was in books. Now, there were only 9 of these extant. He only created, I believe, 9, but there was a cross-reference to neoclassicism in France, but as you just pointed out, and maybe reflecting a little bit on what I said, even though this is the height of neoclassicism, This is not a neoclassical image whatsoever. Very romanticized, the diffuse light, the color, etc. But I don't think I quite answered your question. I believe there was a cross-pollination. I know that the French were aware of the English, even though they were a little bit at odds politically. But I do think because of this being a book and the cover of a book, I believe that there would be some inspirational elements. And I don't know if I directly answer the question, but that's as far as I know on that. But a very interesting question, by the way, very interesting.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome.
This is Dee Dee. I just wanted to say I saw this painting by Blake in, I'm trying to think, near Piccadilly, they have a museum. What's the name of that thing? Anyway, but the title is The Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days.
Of Days, absolutely. It is absolutely, yes.
Right, and Blake is more devout than people tend to credit. That famous children's poem, Tiger, Tiger, burning right in the, and it says, who made thee? God made thee, And so I think Blake is more devout than probably
Constable, would you say? In a different way.
Simply that you cannot necessarily lift it only from his pictures in the books that he published, but that particular picture of the Ancient of Days, in my opinion, is God the Creator, but he's got this tool here, whatever that is that you called it.
It's an archetype. It's like calipers, like a compass.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that is totally, look at the date, 1794, total Enlightenment thinking, meaning we are now shifted into none of this silly stuff. Let's get down to brass tacks. God the Creator knew what he was doing. It's very mathematical, and it has savors of his day. Anyway, that's just my opinion. But
I think
of Days is a title of God.
I think it's very well taken. And I think part of it is because if we, when I talked about Constable had a very pragmatic, but a very, let's say, kind of prosaic, and I don't mean to diminish his spirituality, but a little bit more prosaic connection to Christianity, a more typical. Whereas I think what you're suggesting, and I think you're absolutely right, because some of my readings on Blake, he is devout in a different way, though. I think he's kind of grappling with spirituality, and he's using these biblical references. Mm-hmm. And of course here too, Urizen, Urizen, who's depicted here, is shown as an older man with wisdom. So it just shows us sort of overseeing creation with wisdom and direction. So I think that your interpretation, and obviously you're well steeped in this with your background, I think it's quite correct in what you're saying. And I just think that I might have misspoke that about him, because I think they're sort of moving away so much from reason and going into a more romantic sensibility. And he used a lot of visionary elements. So they're not as clear-cut. You're not looking at Salisbury Cathedral, which is so obvious. This is more of his personal Christian spirit. So I think that's a very good point, Dee Dee, that you bring up.
Yeah, I wanted to add that when I saw this, I was shocked at how small it was.
Oh yeah, if you can look at,
it's not big at all.
Tiny.
And
Yes.
And the second point was simply that, brother, talk about Michelangelo influence. I mean, look at those muscles.
Absolutely.
So he was definitely pre-Raphaelite in the fullest sense of the word, with the respect that the Enlightenment had for the high masters of the Renaissance. I just
absolutely. Yeah. But isn't it interesting how the pre-Raphaelites themselves, the Brotherhood, really didn't want to go past Raphael, the high Renaissance. They did. I mean, they actually. Yeah. And there's when you look at the structure of some of the paintings, not so much in Ophelia, but if you look at Joseph's workshop, they're so un-Renaissance-like. They're very almost.
Absolutely right. Yeah. This one is particularly
so rudimentary in their style. Yeah.
Beautiful thing. It really is. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any questions from the Facebook Live. So thank you so much, Karen, and everybody. And before you go, I would like to remind you that every tour can be found on all our social media channels, including our YouTube and Facebook. And you would like to find further information for future tours, please check out our website events calendar. And again, thank you so much for such a wonderful tour. And for
Thank
all
you
questions.
for your help, Ilse, and also thank you, listeners, for attending the lecture. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.